Thank you for joining us for another Gray Sheet Educational Podcast. I'm Sean Schmidt, Deputy Editor. Today I'm joined by Marla Phillips, Director of Xavier Health at Xavier University, where she leads various initiatives with FDA officials, as well as medical device and pharma professionals. Marla began her career as a chemist and held key industry positions before moving to Xavier, including at Merck, where she was manager of the quality control lab at the firm's Philadelphia plant. Marla ultimately served as the head of quality operations at Merck's North Carolina site. In this podcast, she explains how a Xavier initiative uncovered major paradigm shifts that are enabling industry to approach risk to supply and product through a dramatically different approach that offers an immediate impact. This is a preview of a presentation that Phillips will give at the upcoming MedCon 2015 industry conference hosted by FDA and Xavier University. Thanks for joining us today, Marla.
Great. Thank you, Sean, for that introduction. And it's interesting that you mentioned we'll be giving this presentation at the upcoming conference, because in 2012 it was from this conference as well as our pharma conference that this whole initiative came about. And the reason for that is listening to the pharma conference and the medical device conference about 6 weeks apart, we kept hearing the same concerns being expressed by two different industries. And it was all related towards how do I know that the material I'm receiving from my suppliers is okay? And a lot of this came out of the whole heparin concern and contaminated supply. And so having two different industries express this concern of blind spots in the supply chain, we thought, why don't we bring the industries together with FDA and see if we can do something about it? So leading up to this MedCon conference coming up in a couple of weeks is now going on 4 years since we started this initiative that came out of the conference. So as you can see with the end in mind on the next slide, what we're looking at developing is good supply practices for the industry. And when I say the industry, I do mean both pharma and device. So this initiative is addressing the concerns from both industries, and the solutions will be applicable to both industries. And as you can see here, we're viewing the good supply practices as kind of completing the suite of GXPs. So we're all familiar with GMPs, GIPs, GDPs, and GSPs really helps to round out that suite of GXPs, all with the goal of increasing product confidence. And so on the next slide, you can see that the problem statement that we started with, again, back in 2012, was this voiced concern by the two industries that we are unable to reliably and consistently ensure the supply of incoming materials used in products to serve the pharmaceutical and medical device industries. And as you can see here, we tried to kind of limit the scope so that we could focus our work trying to identify gaps and root causes and solutions on a pretty limited portion of the supply chain when we say incoming materials. But the thought, even back in 2012, was always, if we can figure out a solution for incoming materials, then chances are that same solution can be applied further down the supply chain. And so, as you can see next, what we said then was that, therefore, we need greater assurance that suppliers can reliably and consistently supply safe and quality materials and products to limit the adverse impact on end user safety and brand equity. But by that, again, that's limited. So we're looking at what the suppliers can supply to us, but knowing in the back of our minds that as we get towards the end of developing solutions, we really felt that there would be a way to apply those solutions to now going out from our companies to the end user. So on the next slide, you can see what we found when we came together in August of 2012 was that the mindset was really focused on our suppliers are causing problems. You hear about the issues going on with contaminated supply. We just feel like there's blind spots that are in the supply chain, or that things are happening to lead to whether it's contamination or to adulteration or to economically motivated criminal activity. There's something going on in the supply chain, and it's the suppliers are causing the problems. So what's interesting is in 2012, when we first got together, the focus was how can we certify our suppliers to make sure that the suppliers are basically good enough to be in our supply chain. And that sounds kind of crass, but really it came from the fact that we had the food industry involved at that time as well. And the food industry has the Global Food Safety Initiative where they are certifying their suppliers. And the thought was that once you are certified, you can then become a supplier to the food industry. So the pharma and device industry members heard this and thought, well, gosh, wouldn't that be fantastic if we could do that in pharma and device? Let's certify the suppliers, and then we know that they can now supply our industry. But what we found, as you can see when you go on here, that as time went by, we had the manufacturers who were at the table, and it also included FDA at the time in this part of the work where we were trying to identify gaps. We said, what are the gaps that you're seeing that could lead to this failure or increased risk? And so from August of 2012 to July of 2013, we took the team members of about 20 people through a pretty rigorous process that involved gap analysis, cause and effect matrix, Pareto analysis, and what we presented back to them in July of 2013, that all of their own data was pointing at themselves, not their suppliers. And if you take a step back and think about it, it's pretty hard to, argue against that, because even if you think of your worst supplier, because there are some suppliers out there who are either not doing a good job for some reason, because obviously they're not going to be in business for very long, or they're not capable yet because maybe they're new, but there's some reason where they're not the best supplier for you. The question can then become, how did that supplier get in your supply chain? And that's when there was just this great pause. You could hear a pin drop. And that's when the manufacturers and the members on our team realized that, wow, we are focusing all of our efforts today on fixing the suppliers, when really we need to take a look at how do we fix ourselves, fix the systems that are breaking, that are allowing these things to happen, that are allowing an increase in risk to our final product. So that's when we, as we move on, what you can see on the next slide is that as we continue down the path of trying to figure out more about this paradigm shift and looking at the root causes, what we found was there were three main areas of supply chain risk. And so one of those being supplier qualification. And, that's nothing new, but yet what we were finding is that it's not very robust. So then we also found that self-qualification, if we really are causing a lot of the problems or could have prevented problems, then why aren't we assessing our own ability, and how qualified are we to be in this relationship? And then thirdly, you can see the product and material qualification. So there's a lot of information that's just not understood about our own product, as well as the material we are getting from our suppliers. So as you can see, as you continue on this slide, it goes around from supplier qualification to self-qualification to product material qualification. Okay, so on the next slide, you would see the solution overview, where we take these three sources of risk, the product risk, supply risk, and the self-risk. And under those, as we click through, you'll see that under the product risk, what we found is that we really need to have internal alignment on material and product requirements, and that this is often not being done. So internal alignment, even meaning the marketing group, what needs do they have at early phase product development that would help us make sure that we identify the right material from the right supplier in the right geographical location that's meeting the product needs, and that eventually will then meet the intended use. So once you have the internal alignment on material and product requirements, then you can have internal alignment on the supplier requirements. So what do we need of our suppliers? And then next, as you can see, that's when you can engage the supplier. And what we were finding is two different variances on this, is that the supplier was being engaged so early in the process that we didn't even know ourselves what we needed. We hadn't aligned internally. And we were telling the supplier we need this, and then another cross-functional group was saying, no, we need that. And we were basically causing a lot of work that wasn't needed. So after we engage the supplier at the right time, then that's when we can make sure that we have the right material that we need. Because the other extreme that we were finding is that the suppliers were being engaged too late. And so then, of course, that can be a problem in that we've gone so far down the path of figuring out what we think we need because of what we think we want, and finding out that we're going down the wrong path and have to undo a lot of work that was already done. So this internal alignment is actually really key, and then that allows us to get into the external alignment with our supplier. Now we can have the right material qualified and have supplier qualification. So then the next piece of this is under self-risk reduction. So we talked about self-qualification on the previous slide, about if we are causing some of these problems and can prevent problems, then how qualified are we? So we're actually developing a self-qualification process that is measurable and can tell you where you stand on, as far as a risk factor to the relationship. Excuse me. So then what that leads to, as you can see next, is that there's a behavioral awareness and improvement process. And as you can see next, it really flows across into the product risk reduction and supply risk reduction. So it really shows that the self-risk is a big piece of that. And then finally on this slide, what you'll see is the knowledge management that needs to be maintained across all three aspects so that we don't lose track of assumptions that were being made and decisions that were being made and why. But then also transparency is another foundational piece to what we're developing, so that you not only have the external transparency that you might hear about with your supplier, what do you share, when do you share it, why do you share it, but also internal. Believe it or not, that's a big problem. Making sure that there's transparency across cross-functional groups, making sure that there is that alignment and everyone is on the same page. So this is an overview of the solutions that we're developing, but just know I'm going to give you just a glimpse today of what we'll present in more detail at the conference. But each of these has actual solutions that can be implemented underneath them. And I'll give you a glimpse of that on the next slide. So again, as I mentioned, supplier qualification is nothing new, but what we're finding is that it's not being done in a very robust way. So for example, supplier qualification is typically looked at from a quality perspective. You know, maybe even if it's a supplier we've had engaged with us before, we look at their performance history with us. But we're not looking at things like their capacity, their geographical location, the risk of the material. What capability does the supplier have, not only today, but in the future, knowing our future needs? What is the compliance history of the supplier? And then also the financial stability of that supplier. So there are other aspects, and again, this is just even a glimpse of those aspects of supplier qualification that are not considered in most companies today as they're doing supplier qualification. Next, what you'll see on this slide is, as I mentioned, the self-qualification. So what we're looking at is, what is our own compliance? What resources are we dedicating to our supplier relationships? Are they enough? What is the stability of the workforce within our company? And then I'm not going to get into it today, but we'll be presenting it in more detail. But our own product knowledge is shockingly lacking on what we know about our product, what impacts our product, and what we need to know about the material coming into our product. Another thing that we found is, through this research I haven't mentioned, we did the research with the manufacturers, and after we did that, we did a survey across food, drug, and device suppliers and asked them what they were seeing as far as gaps in supplier-client relationship management. And they corroborated the findings of the manufacturers and also really emphasized the forecast accuracy. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. We tell our suppliers we need 10 lots by the end of the month, and then we say, oh no, we only need 5, and then all of a sudden we need 50. And we keep shifting things around to the point where we are setting them up for risk of failure. And also, they can't even campaign for us the way that they could have originally if we had stuck with the forecast. So the constant shifting of our forecast induces potential for error at our supplier. And often you don't hear about it from them because they're trying to satisfy you as their client. And then, as I've mentioned in the previous slides, internal alignment is another big key when we're looking at self-qualification. How aligned are we? What formal processes do we have in place to make sure this happens? And again, I'm not going to show it here today, but we actually have a tool that we are developing that will help companies make sure they have the right people at the table at the right time, making the right decisions, and everything's documented. So what you'll see next on this slide is the cool part of this. I'm sorry, if you go back. The cool part of this is that you can then overlay the supplier qualification with the self-qualification. So you have a risk score for your supplier and a risk score for yourself. You overlay those, and now you have a risk of each individual relationship. So it can tell you on a heat map where you need to be focusing your time and attention. So there's a lot of really cool features about the solutions we're developing. This was just a glimpse of just a couple of them. So again, on the next slide, the really I guess the take-home message for this that is action-provoking is recognizing that we are all part of the challenge and we are all part of the solution. And if you look in the mirror first, true root cause is critical to meaningful improvement. And of course, it's easier to point your fingers at others, but it's actually easier to fix yourself than trying to convince someone else they need to be fixed. So what's really neat about this initiative is we've identified true root causes, and we're more easily able to fix them because it's fixing ourselves. And so it gives us a lot of great opportunity to make improvements through these good supply practices for both the pharma and device industries.
Thanks for the great info, Marla. I know we're all looking forward to your presentation at MedCon. As always, you can check out our full suite of podcasts and visual podcasts at thegreatsheet.com. Thanks for listening.